There are certain things in any kind of community that people genuinely seem to dislike for no apparent reason at all, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. Hi, my name is Milan. I share my lessons here on YouTube, and as I said, we're discussing fitness YouTubers. Why don't people like them in general, and is the hate really justified? The first thing that I'd like to discuss, and the main reason why people dislike science-based lifters, is because they're not big enough to be liked. So when you look at some of the most famous fitness influencers, the majority of them is on steroids. Yeah, that's not really a big secret, I'd say, but the majority, or let's say 90, okay, let's be conservative, 80% of the most famous fitness influencers out there are on the Sawzall. They're on something, okay? And so when you look at those kinds of people, the guys that are the most popular and also the biggest, you say to them, or rather you say to yourself, science-based lifters are smaller, therefore their advice isn't really that relevant. Science-based lifters don't know what they're talking about. You cannot compare those two, because the vast majority of science-based lifters aren't actually on gear. They're mostly natural, or they're fully natural, and so you cannot really compare guys who train naturally and have been training for a long time to guys like Togi, a guy who doesn't even lift at all and just takes steroids, and he's massively popular. So that's one of the things that we have to take into consideration when discussing science-based lifting. But I will say, one argument against science-based lifting that I personally have is some of the exercises are retarded, okay? We can honestly say that climbing to the fucking cable machine, on top of the cable machine, and doing some weird inverted bicep curls with a cable, whatever, that is pointless in my opinion, since the amount of time it actually takes you to set up a bench in a certain degree or a certain angle where the muscle is in the most stretched position, and so it has the most tension at that bottom position, or setting up the cable machine in that way, it takes a lot of time. And honestly, if you just wanted to do a normal variation of that exercise that you wanted to do in the first place, the normal exercise, let's say, you'd honestly have better results. Plus, when you train with free weights and with barbells and so on, you train a lot of the stabilizer muscles that you usually wouldn't train with cables. I will say that. However, there are good things when it comes to science-based lifting. And for example, when people look at some of the biggest guys, actually, so we're talking the guys that go to Mr. Olympia, and they say, oh, but look at that, this guy who's a Mr. Olympia doesn't train like a science-based lifter. What do you actually mean by science-based? Because he's clearly tracking his calories, he's tracking the weights that he's doing every single session, so he's doing progressive overload. He has good technique, and also he does the slow eccentric thing, so he doesn't do just concentric movements with a very fast eccentric motion. No, he's a science-based lifter, although not in the sense of that he's pretentious and that he likes to make himself smart on camera. No, he's not a science-based lifter in that realm, but he does train like a science-based lifter. Therefore, we can say some of the biggest guys that are out there are actually science-based lifters. And honestly, if you do any kind of progressive overload technique or proper technique training, and anything that is connected to science, or anything that actually has a scientific foundation for it to be true, you're kind of a science-based lifter. I know some of you are gonna watch this and be like, oh, I can't believe it, I just wanted to do my normal bicep curls and not be a science-based lifter. But that's besides the fact. I will say, however, when you look at those biggest guys, there are in fact science-based lifters, and they have better results. Also, I know this video is all over the place, but I'm just speaking what's on my mind. When people look at guys like Ronnie Coleman, Jay Cutler, Arnold Schwarzenegger, guys like that didn't really train like we train today. And the argument people have is, well, look at how Jay Cutler trained. He didn't use those eccentric movements, and he was clearly bigger than you. Yes, that is true. I will say that. I'm not 270 pounds on stage or something crazy like that. But if they trained like modern bodybuilders in a smart, progressive, overload-oriented way, and if they actually track their macros and exercises and so on, they would look even bigger. So if somehow we could bring 2001 Ronnie Coleman to the present moment and give him the science-based tips that are currently relevant, he'd be even bigger in this present day and age. Also, steroids are way more developed now, so he'd be even more bigger when it comes to that. But technically, steroids are scientifically made, and so if you take steroids, you're actually a very what am I talking about? Yeah, you're a science-based lifter if you use steroids, because steroids are technically chemicals and so on. But yeah, so the main argument people have against science-based lifting is the fact that science-based lifters aren't really that big. But in this video, I've actually proved that a lot of the people that are actually the biggest, so we're not talking about social media influencers here, we're talking about the current Mr. Olympias and the future Mr. Olympias and so on. When we're talking about those guys, they are in fact science-based lifters. They may not be sitting on their computers every single day and just reading fitness articles and fitness studies and so on, but they are in fact somewhat connected to science-based lifting. I will now speak about my story, what I actually did. So when I started lifting, I was kind of into this science-based thing in the sense of I watched a lot of tutorials. So I watched how to squat, how to deadlift, how much protein should you eat every single day. I didn't do it that obsessively to a point where I literally only watched fitness videos, but I did, in fact, I wouldn't say waste, I'd rather say invested a certain portion of my time into this whole science-based lifting thing. And so what I got was okay results, I will say that. When I think about this, in the first 2 years, I obviously built the most muscle, new begins, and so on. But after the second or maybe the third year, I actually got less gains. And it was very drastic in the sense of first 2 years, I literally gained 20 kilograms of weight or 45 pounds. But after that point, it was getting very, very difficult. And so I started researching more into science-based lifting. And eventually I came across Mike Israetel and his videos. What he promoted was the slow eccentric and also the deep stretch of any exercise. For example, how I did the bench press. I literally didn't even care about the eccentric motion and just focused on the concentric and so on. Didn't really care about the deep stretch. And that was the principle for any kind of movement that I had at that point. Well, now I educated myself. I started focusing on that deep stretch. So not to finish the movement here, for example, if I'm doing with dumbbells, not to finish the movement here, but rather fully try to touch the outside of my bicep or my shoulder with the outside of the dumbbell. So get that deep stretch and also the slow eccentric movement and so on. When I applied those things into my training sessions, I actually got way better results, and I'm getting to a point now where I'm actually trying to get as strong as I can. Of course, I will say, however, that I've gotten to a point where I'm that guy who lifts. So people look at me and people recognize me on the street and they say, wow, you've gotten jacked, la la la. And so I can say now truly that I look like a guy that actually lifts, especially when my shirt isn't on. But that's for girls exclusively to look at, and also people that follow me on my Instagram, but that's irrelevant right now. And also, my current goal isn't really to build as much muscle as humanly possible. No, right now my current goal is actually to get strong as possible and also to build some muscle along the way. or during that journey to get as strong as humanly possible. So my goals are 180 kilogram bench, 300 kilogram deadlift, and let's say 250 kilogram squat. I don't care about saying that in pounds, or rather I can't do the math right now. I genuinely do not care to convert that into pounds. I'll put something up on the screen, but hopefully you've learned something during this video, and hopefully you don't hate science-based lifters after this video, since everybody is technically a science-based lifter if they use scientific methods and techniques to get as much progress as humanly possible. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you want to, you can watch this video, and I'd highly appreciate it if you could subscribe to the channel here. And as always, see you at the top.